Stop screen sharing.
Okay. Shall we kick off?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to thank everybody. Good evening. I'd like to thank everyone for joining the panel this evening. My name is Renee Kinsella. I'm the chair of the Budget, Education, and City Services Committee of CB5. My background is that I'm an attorney by training, but most recently I've worked in the nonprofit sports-based youth development arena. Community Board 5, for those who don't know, runs roughly from 14th Street to 59th Street, from Lexington Avenue to 8th Avenue, essentially the very center of Manhattan. And one of the things that we've noticed in our district, and I believe is true of CB4 too, but I'll defer to Maria, is that there's been an increase of individuals living on the street, many perhaps suffering with mental illness. And in fact, when we were looking at this and spoke to some of the outreach people, we learned that the caseload has seen an increase of about 100 people from this time last year. Maria?
Thank you, Renee. My name is Maria Ortiz. I am co-chair of Housing, Health, and Human Services of Manhattan Community Board 4. Community Board 4 covers Chelsea, Hudson Yards, and Hell's Kitchen. I am actually a licensed social worker, and let's see. Yeah, that's all I'll share for now, Renee.
We just want to thank all of the representatives that are in the room. I think we have some of them who had signed up who are not here at the moment, but we will be sending this to the Brian Lafferty from the Borough President's Office and Franklin Richards from City Council, member Keith Powers' office. And I think, Maria, you have some as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So from City Council Speaker's Office, Corey Johnson, we will have Brittany Bowen and Lori Harjowirogo. Lori, I apologize if you're here and I hacked your name. From Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal's office, we should have Erica Overton or Alex Levin. And from the New York State Senator Brad Hoylman's office, we should have Maya Burlow and or Tevin Williams. The reason that we're doing this event is basically to increase awareness and to talk about next steps. We advise people usually to call 311, but what happens next? What services are offered to the person? What's the current continuum of care from 311 through possible aftercare? This panel really will help us deepen our understanding not only of the current care that exists, but also the gaps in those services. Finally, we also want to begin to explore the struggle between mental health care and self-determination. The run of show is going to include a panel discussion, 2 rounds of a panel discussion. First, each expert panelist will introduce themselves and give a short overview of the services they provide in the continuum of care if someone were to call 311 on an individual that we can call Jane Doe or John Doe. The next round, panelists will describe the gaps in care that currently exist that they see in their everyday work. That will be followed by some questions from the public that you asked during sign up. Next will be a Q&A portion where questions that have come in during the forum in the Q&A will be asked by our very own moderator, Joseph Frewer. Please put your questions in the Q&A by 7 p.m. And then finally, the last words by each panelist will be about what they would like the public and elected officials to know regarding next steps or a call for action, and we should be done by 8. For the purposes of this discussion, SMI, or serious, I should say, I'm sorry, I'm using social work jargon, SMI. Serious mental illness is having a diagnosis and a significant impairment in school or work or interpersonal relationships, and being homeless, at least for this forum, when we're talking about homeless, we mean unsheltered individuals. So individuals living on the streets and not in a shelter. The other thing that I just want to share with everyone is that part of my motivation for being a social worker actually is because I have family members actually who are diagnosed with serious mental illness and have experienced being unsheltered. Renee, is there anything else you want to add before we go to the panelists?
No, I think you've covered it.
All right, great. So panelists, I'm going to ask that you briefly introduce yourself, your position, and the services your organization provides in this continuum of care. Starting with Nick Urban.
Thanks very much, Maria. Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here on this panel. Thanks very much for the invite. You'll have to bear with me for a bit. I'm afraid I'm a little under the weather. We're going to power through here. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a senior director at Breaking Ground, which is a nonprofit in the city. I oversee all of Breaking Ground's Manhattan outreach operations, which includes their city-funded Street to Home program, which is part of the larger Manhattan Outreach Consortium that covers the full island. So the Breaking Ground city-funded program, Street to Home, covers from the north side of 23rd Street up to 59th Street, river to river, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We've always got teams of outreach workers, case managers, and so forth out engaging folks. In addition to that, I oversee 5 private outreach partnerships that we have with different entities in the city, also generally in the Midtown area. And I oversee a recently opened stabilization bed site that provides 84 beds for folks who are experiencing street homelessness. And that's about a block east of Union Square. More support services, more privacy than the traditional shelter system. And that has gotten off the ground. We're bringing a lot of folks in there, so forth. That's it in a nutshell. Breaking Ground is the largest supportive housing provider in the city and is also the primary street outreach provider in both Brooklyn and Queens. So in addition to our Manhattan work that I oversee, we cover those boroughs as well. When I say supportive housing, I mean permanent supportive housing, which are permanent residence for folks that include wraparound services such as ongoing case management, medical care, psychiatric care, and so forth. Breaking Ground also partners with CUCS, and we're going to hear about those services in more detail, but we provide in that partnership street medical services, mobile psychiatry services, as well as assistance with housing, benefits, identification, substance use care, psychiatric care, basically anything that you can think of in a real soup to nuts fashion, from the time that someone is first encountered on the street all the way through aftercare when they're in permanent housing sites and whatever comes up in between. For folks who have done this work for a while, you know that everyone's path to homelessness is a little different. So we really try to work one-on-one, one client at a time, and get them where they want to be. I've worked in homeless services, community mental health care, and substance use research in New York City since around 2009. Outside of my work with Breaking Ground, I'm a psychotherapist as well. So, and finally, I'm a Chelsea resident. Part of the reason that I started to work with Breaking Ground was so that I could try to have a specific impact in my own community. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Nick. Dr. Yu.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. So I'm Vanyoo. I'm a psychiatrist. It's actually good that you have Nick and I together because I'm the Chief Medical Officer of the aforementioned CUCS, the Center for Urban Community Services, and its healthcare affiliate, Jennings Medical Care. I'll explain CUCS in a minute, for 1 minute. So CUCS is a big social service agency. We provide a lot of different services to people who are homeless or formerly homeless, New Yorkers who are homeless or formerly homeless, including a lot of supportive housing services. We operate a couple of shelters. We operate a couple of safe havens. CUCS is the agency that is sort of oversees the whole Manhattan Outreach Consortium, of which Breaking Ground has one of the teams in Manhattan. And then Jennings Medical Care is the healthcare part of CUCS. We employ all the licensed medical staff of the agency, so psychiatrists, primary care providers, and nurses. And most relevant to this conversation is that we provide all the street medicine and street psychiatry for all the Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens teams. So the team, so the Breaking Ground team that covers the catchment area that is in question here is there's a street medicine team and a street psychiatry team that works with the Breaking Ground outreach team. And I actually just looked right before we came on, I looked at some numbers just to give you a sense of how much those clinical teams do. So the street medicine team in the 12 months that ended in July, on July 1st of this year, provided some kind of care to at least 50 people in the area. And the street psychiatry team, at least 150 people. And then the last thing I'll say is that a million years ago, I worked in the psychiatric emergency room at Bellevue. So I have some insight into stuff that goes on there too. Thanks.
Thank you. Sadie, is she?
Hi, I'm Sadie Ishii. I'm an attorney with Mental Hygiene Legal Service, and I'm here today to explain the legal perspective as regards to people who end up involuntarily hospitalized as a result of their mental illness. And in New York State, anybody who's hospitalized on the basis of mental illness for psychiatric care and treatment is entitled to a free lawyer. And those lawyers are provided by statute. It's my agency, Mental Hygiene Legal Service. We operate offices in hospitals all throughout the state. In New York City, many of our attorneys are in hospitals such as Bellevue every single day interacting with patients. The reason that this structure exists in New York is because New York has a very strong commitment to the idea of individual liberty and the idea that somebody who is involuntarily hospitalized has a critical right to have their voice heard, to have their perspective heard, and to have access to the legal system to ensure that they only remain involuntarily hospitalized to the extent that the law would allow. So I guess I'm here to answer any questions that come up with regard to what those standards are and what the line looks like between when somebody can, by law, remain on the street or when involuntary hospitalization can be legally supported.
Thank you so much, Sadie. Catherine OSullivan is here. Catherine.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having me. I'm Catherine OSullivan. I am here to represent the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I am their director of single point of access, treatment and care coordination services here at the Bureau of Mental Health. And just a little background on what we call SPOA services, single point of access. Their services designed for individuals with serious mental illness, as mentioned earlier. And the New York State Office of Mental Health requires every local governmental unit statewide to operate a single point of access. And we manage access to different types of mobile treatment like assertive community treatment. We manage access to care coordination. We also manage access to intensive mobile treatment, which I can talk about further on in our panel. And so our, SPOA services are a subset of the larger mental health system. So I just want to make sure to stress that there are a wide array of mental health services and behavioral health services available in the community, but through SPOA, we deal mainly with mobile treatment for individuals with serious mental illness and also some care coordination. Our unit also oversees some of the direct services and contracts that our providers provide directly. So we contract out to nonprofits. And so, we've worked with CUCS, we've worked with Breaking Ground in different capacities. And so we're familiar, with their work. And so I mainly here to speak to how to access these services, but also since, we were speaking to members of the public, also want to talk a little bit about how to access crisis services before you get to a point where someone might need to be connected to more long-term mental health care, intensive mental health care.
Thank you, Catherine. We also have Ellie Madison.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Ellie Madison. I am the Executive Director of Fountain House. I've been working here for about 22 years at Fountain House. Fountain House has been focused, as it always has been, on serious mental illness in this community, in Community Board 4 and Community Board 5, for about 73 years. So a very long time. We serve between this site and our site in the Bronx, we serve about 2,000 people a year. We also have a housing program that houses about 400 people, everything from 24-hour community residences to scattered site independent apartments and all the different residences in between. Our focus really is providing a community of support, peer support, social practice support for people with serious mental illness that is longitudinal throughout their entire life. And we've been doing this, as I said, for 73 years, so for a very long time. Recently, we've been involved in launching a number of projects that we call on-ramps, which specifically look to help connect serious mentally ill street homeless to communities, not just Fountain House, but maybe one of the other 16 clubhouses across the city or other community supports, because we know, we believe, and we've experienced over all these years that real recovery, real stability is dependent on having a community of support. And that community of support can range from, clinical services, which we do have, to work, education, and housing, but all focused on this community. And we work with a number of partners. Our friends Breaking Ground, we're working with in the Times Square area, Ryan Chelsea Clinic, Sun River Health, and so on and so forth. But what's a little bit different for us from the rest is that we're really focused on this kind of community solution, and it, for this issue. We'll be talking about that as we go on tonight.
Thank you so much. So just to frame it for the audience, if someone were to call 311 or 911, they see someone in distress, what happens? How do we understand what happens, and where do your services fit into that paradigm? Nick, I think if we could start with you.
Sure. So the city outreach teams, part of their contractual obligation is to respond to all 311 service requests for someone requiring homeless services. And you can specify that on both the app or if you call into the system. So within an hour, our outreach teams go to the location and try to find the individual that was described, engage them, and offer them whatever the appropriate service seems to be in that moment, whether it's some kind of housing, shelter, a drop-in center, medical services, psychiatric care, whatever it may be based on that presentation. So typically 311 for a homeless service request is routed to an outreach team directly, and they respond to that call. And
if it's 911?
That's a completely different system, the emergency services system in the city, that I can't speak to as fluently as perhaps someone else might be able to.
Okay. And how would the 311, the outreach team comes, how then do the other, maybe SPOA or maybe Dr. Yu can jump in here, how do your services get layered into that? The outreach team comes, they're assisting that person into housing, or they're assisting that person into some other care?
Should I jump
Dr.
in there?
Yu,
I mean, they're offering to assist that person into those services that you mentioned. Much of what we provide, the vast majority of what is provided, is completely voluntary, and I think that's kind of the rub for a lot of it. But please, Dr. Yu.
Yeah, so I think that the main goal of all the outreach services, of all the outreach teams, and actually the outreach contracts have were incentivized this way starting back in 2007, is to house people. That's the goal, right? And then everything else that's happening in the outreach teams are designed to support that goal. So for example, the reason why there's always been psychiatry on the outreach teams is the recognition that a majority of people who are single, adult, and living outside are living either with serious mental illness or substance use disorders or both. And furthermore, that if you don't address those disorders, that really gets in the way of a person participating in the housing process. So that's why there's always been psychiatry with those teams. And then we layered street medicine on top of that starting in 2016, because many of those people are also suffering from chronic medical conditions. And those medical conditions also get in the way of people participating in housing services. And so the goal of even the street medicine and the psychiatry teams is to help the outreach team get people housed, right? And then, jumping a little ahead to the punchline here is that, I think that the primary problem that we're all like sort of, talking about this evening is there's not enough housing. There's not enough, and specifically when I'm talking about people who are living outside, it's a kind of housing called supportive housing, right? So remember, I just told you a majority of people are suffering with some kind of serious illness, which like housing and urban development, the federal housing and urban development characterizes as a disability that makes you eligible for supportive housing. It's housing that is designed to help people not only get housed in the first place, but to stay housed, because without those supports, people have trouble staying. This is why they become homeless in the first place, right? And supportive housing has been shown to be very effective at keeping people living with certain kinds of disabilities housed, right? And it's also cost effective, right? There's been study after study showing that if a jurisdiction provides supportive housing to a person, that the jurisdiction saves money, right? Because the person, when they're living outside, there's all kinds of costs involved. There's like police costs and ambulance costs and hospital costs and jail costs and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's not only a humane thing to do, it also saves money, right? But the problem is that there's just not enough, right? So at any given, Nick, I'm going to put you on the spot probably a few times this evening. At any given moment, all the outreach teams have probably dozens of people with approved housing applications. There's just not enough housing, right? And it's not for lack of trying. The city, state, and federal government have over the years, especially in New York, freed up lots of resources to create supportive housing, and just all these resources just haven't been able to keep up with the demand. So I'll stop there.
So I'll just add, if I can share screen, it might be the easiest way to do this, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
A single point of access services are not usually, 301 is not the path to single point of access services. Oftentimes, SPOA services are referred to by different entities, usually providers, hospitals, shelters, corrections, people who are familiar with us and already have access in the web system. And so if we're talking about behavioral health crises, I do want to share this infographic here that could be useful in painting the picture of some of the options in New York City. Can everybody see that? So we tried to do our best to just briefly describe the landscape around behavioral health crisis services that are available, and some have been mentioned. There are a few ways that you can access services. So if there's an individual who has behavioral health crises that's living on the street or subway and you call 311, as mentioned, you get connected with homeless outreach. And Nick's programs are one of the contractors. If there's someone that lives at home or a shelter or another type of residence, you can contact NYC Well. You can Google them, you can dial 1-888 NYC Well. And based on a number of questions that will be asked to assess the situation, the needs of the individual, you can be connected to a number of services, whether a mobile crisis team that can come out within I think it used to be 24 hours. Now they're working on 2-hour response time to talk to individuals that are experiencing a behavioral health crisis, who are unable or unwilling to engage in care. You may be able to access a crisis respite center that's like an alternative to hospitalization for certain conditions. And then there's a triage desk that contracts with the city that would help gain access to what we call HEAT teams, health engagement and assessment teams. And so they offer pre and post crisis support services for individuals that have behavioral health challenges, and we'll work with them for up to 3 months to try to connect them to the right care. If through that triage desk, they realize the person needs a little more than what HEAT can offer in the moment due to the crisis, if it's non-emergent, they offer both pre and post crisis services for folks who have challenges that may be at risk of harming themselves or others where it's not imminent, where 911 isn't necessary. And co-response teams are partnered up, NYPD with a social worker. And then the more traditional outpatient services, which we hear are in high demand. We're in contact with many clinics, and many of them are doing their best to manage wait lists and to manage the ongoing referrals that they receive for outpatient care. And that's typically, you know, therapy, psychotherapy, and or med management. And lastly, comprehensive, what we call CPEPs, comprehensive emergency programs, or psychiatric emergency departments. And this is for, you know, urgent evaluation needs. So many of these can be accessed through NYC Well. Lastly, if someone is experiencing a crisis that's a safety issue to them, to harm to themselves or others, 911 is your best case, right? Because we want to get folks help immediately, and usually that involves NYPD and FDNY and bringing the person to their local psychiatric emergency department for evaluation and assessment. So this has kind of been our experience with how you can utilize and access 311. And so our SPOA services are often accessed through, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. I'll do a new share also. Let me pause, let me see how this works. I'm sorry, folks. I should be an expert at this by now. New share. So this brings me to when folks do get to SPOA services, I hope you all can see the new screen. A different page, I hope everyone can see now. Yeah.
It looks like the same one to me. Can
It
I
looks like
fix
the same one.
It's the
Okay.
same. Mhm.
How about
There we
now?
go.
I see a different.
There we
Okay.
go.
Good, yeah.
All right. So this is more of an infographic for our SPOA single point of access services. And on the left side, you'll see the number of referral sources, not the only ones, but majority of our referrals come through homeless services, inpatient or outpatient mental health providers, corrections, jail, prison, and community-based organizations. And through completing an application that's reviewed and eligibility is determined through our team, they can have access to a range of services from top to bottom, top most intense. And that's our IMT treatment programs, and then our sort of community treatment programs that also include shelter partnered ACT and forensic ACT teams, as well as care coordination. And so this essentially is an array of services based on the individual's needs. All of these are community based in that they go out to the individual, meet them wherever they can be located. Our IMT and ACT community treatment programs provide an array of mobile mental health and substance use treatment, including medication and supports for individuals with serious mental illness. And IMT will kick it up a notch in that we often work with individuals who may be transient touching multiple systems, shelter, street, hospital, jail. And so these teams have a lower ratio of like person to client, and so that they can spend more time engaging individuals. So we've expanded our IMT program over the last 6 months and continues to grow with 20 new programs slated for this fiscal year, which is almost triple what we had. We started with 11. We started with 4, expanded to 11, and added 20 more programs that we continue to ramp up and develop over this fiscal year. Sorry, so I'm going to stop sharing. I realize I took a bit of time, but I wanted to preface SPOA with like what other services are available before you even get to SPOA.
Great, thank you. And just quickly, Sadie, if you could speak to us at the continuum, at the other continuum, 911 is called, someone ends up in a hospital, what happens then for that person in the most?
Sure. So we're seeing clients who are in the worst case scenario here, where they have been admitted to a hospital, which means that they have gone through the emergency department and doctors have evaluated them there and have determined that they are a danger to themselves or to others immediately. Doctor, you could probably speak to that some from his experience at Bellevue. And when that happens, that triggers a host of due process protections. And that's critically important because it's important that the person's voice doesn't get lost in the system, that essentially they still have the experience and the feeling that their perspective is being taken into account. And, you know, I think that's really important in terms of long-term participation in treatment as well, that they feel like the system treated them fairly throughout the process. So what they are entitled to basically is to ask to leave the hospital. If they ask to leave the hospital, they're entitled to a court hearing, at which point a judge will determine whether the person is currently a danger to themselves or others. If it is determined that they are currently a danger to themselves or others, then they can be hospitalized for progressively longer periods of time with periodic review of that hospitalization. But I would say that in practice, one thing that we definitely see is a revolving door of the same people getting hospitalized over and over and over again, because the extent of the services that are available to them in the community, or the extent to which they are willing or able to access those services, is insufficient to address their needs on a long-term basis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sadie. That's actually going to bring us to our part of what we want to hear more about, this revolving door that you're talking about, and the same people that we see over and over again in the next section, if we could kind of hone in on that. So thank you for sharing what it might look like for someone who is street homeless after a 311 or a 911 call, but I really want to talk about like when someone falls through the cracks, and exactly, Sadie, what you were saying. And I want to also think about if everything is on the table, from very practical suggestions to blue sky recommendations. Is it funding? Is it legislation that needs to be changed? Do we need a new model? And starting with, I would like if we could start with Nick. Oh, and one more thing, one more reminder for everyone who is listening in on Zoom, can you please submit your questions by 7 p.m.? Someone is reading through them now, sorting through them, and we're gonna pull out themes and some questions and be asking the panelists your questions a little bit later. So if we can start with you, Nick.
Sure. You know,
Thank
what
you.
I'll echo is what Dr. Yu said a couple minutes ago, which is that the most simple solution, most practical solution, and I think what the most effective solution would be, is an increase in housing, both permanent supportive housing, I'll say more than both, permanent supportive housing, low-income housing, and also some of the transitional housing that we've seen proliferate pretty massively over the course of the last year and a half. One of the, I guess I'll call it silver linings of the pandemic has been this multiple stabilization bed sites have opened up, And the model that they've used, because of social distancing and isolation and so forth, that was necessitated by this COVID-19 pandemic, was single rooms. So it's not just the creation of housing, both permanent, low income, and supportive, it's the type of housing that gets created. It has to be the bed or the room or the unit that a person actually wants to go to and wants to utilize. And that's both the kind of makeup of the room itself and also the location of the room. So the folks that we see in Midtown, if they're on the street for months or for years, that's essentially their home neighborhood. So to come along and offer them, say, a dorm or shared setting in the Bronx, that's not necessarily going to work for them. It's not where they live their day-to-day life. And it's not something that they're necessarily going to want to do as far as that shared setting is concerned. I'll throw a quick statistic at you. We track the transitional housing placements that we make each year. This is outside of the traditional municipal shelter system, fiscal year over year. And what we saw in the fiscal year that ended earlier, we go July to June. This fiscal year of 2021, we brought 326 people into these transitional housing sites, just from our catchment area in Midtown. The previous year, that number was 183. So again, a jump from 183 to 326. And that is not because, in our experience, that there were more people on the street. It's that the resources that we were able to offer to people were more appealing and they were more likely to take us up on them. So it's housing, it's the type of housing, it's the location of that housing. Those are the things that get people across the threshold. We work on this housing first and harm reduction model. The idea is that if you can get someone the stability of not living on the street and all the surrounding stress and worry and threat and vulnerability that comes along with that, the other pieces will fall into place more easily. It's easier to find someone. It's easier to provide the services to them if they're in a consistent location. They're not worried about being attacked. They're not worried about being robbed. Their mental health symptoms aren't exacerbated by this perpetual stress that they're living in. They're not at physical risk, medical risk, all of these things. So if there's one solution, in my opinion, it's that. It's more housing, it's these different types of housing, it's the structure of it, and it's the location of it.
Thank you, Nick. Dr. Yu?
Yeah, great. I was going to ask if I could pile on to what Nick was saying. I'll start by making a comment about involuntary treatment. I'd be happy to go back to it, but there is a role, I believe, for involuntary treatment, and there's not enough, in my opinion, hospital capacity at the city or state level at the moment. However, I also think that the days of indefinite open-ended involuntary treatment and housing, I mean, the state hospitals were basically housing for many, many years, are over for all kinds of reasons. And we actually probably don't want to go back to that anyway. So, but putting that aside, I think Nick, I'll just reinforce, a theme of what Nick was saying was that, so if we're left with voluntary, I actually peeked in the Q&A, so I saw these questions about, if people are refusing treatment, but then what, right? Well, I think the trick is to convince people that you've got something for them, right? That they can trust, right? So everybody who's living outside is traumatized, for one thing, right? Including by the service system that was designed to help them, right? Not that we're beating people up, it's just that, people feel stigmatized by the service system, and not because we're stigmatizing people on purpose, just because of the way we are forced to operate in certain situations. But, or also like we're trying to like convince people to go to a shelter in the Bronx when, right, as Nick said, their neighborhood is Chelsea. So increasing resources in such a way such that I can, go and spend time with a person, go visit a person in Madison Square Park repeatedly over time to gain trust, to nurture a working relationship with that person, right? And when a person who's living in that park gets to know me and decides like, oh, that Dr. Yu, he's somebody who cares about me, who I can trust, who's not going to make me do something I don't want to do, maybe I'll, give him a listen to and see if he's actually got something for me, right? And I should have said earlier that And one of the challenges, remember I said earlier that if we're not able to address a person's serious mental illness or substance use disorders, that's really going to stand in their way of their ability to participate in the housing process, and even their desire to participate in the housing process, right? Like if right, and that's because that's a priority issue, right? If you're living in Madison Square Park, mental health care for me is like really low on your list of priorities for the day. 1, 2, and 3 is like, how am I not going to get beat up today? What am I going to do if it starts raining? Where am I going to eat? Where am I going to go to the bathroom? Right. So by the time I get there at 10 in the morning or whatever it is, like, I don't have time for you, Dr. Yu. So if we can address all these other things in some kind of an effective way that feels trustworthy and caring and compassionate, then you can start getting somewhere with people. And Nick's teams, like, that's what they spend probably most of their time doing, is just building these relationships with people. But that's quite an investment, right? That's a lot of time. Like, it's really expensive, frankly, to pay me to spend time sitting on a park bench with somebody, gaining their trust, right? But it's totally worth it. And it ends up being cost effective, by the way. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yu. Sadie?
Sorry, having a little trouble with my unmute button there. I'd like to pick up on something that Dr. Yu said, basically sounding the same theme about capacity. We often have clients who are involuntarily hospitalized and get stabilized to the point where they are ready for discharge, and then they face extensive waits to get connected with services outside of the hospital. And I know that the clinicians at the hospital would love to keep those people until they can get connected with services in the community. But in terms of the constitutional floor, once they're no longer a danger to themselves or others, that is not a constitutional basis for commitment. So one thing that happens, with some frequency is that people get released from the hospital before they've gotten connected with the services. And either that's through the judicial process or that's by the clinicians. And it's not because they don't need the services. It's not because they wouldn't accept the services. It's because they are not willing to be deprived of their liberty for a longer period of time that it will take to wait for the capacity to become available for the services for them. So I think, increasing housing options that people want to live in, increasing the number of ACT teams that are available in the community, increasing all of the possible services that people can have is all going to ultimately get to the same point of having fewer people who need the involuntary level of services in the first place.
Thank you, Sadie. Catherine, you're up.
So I echo everyone who's gone before me. Housing is invaluable. I think you can't put a price on it. And while supportive housing is proven to be effective in the housing first model, I firmly believe in, having worked in supportive housing for a long period of time before my current role, there's not enough of it. And yes, it's expensive. Transitional housing and it as a model has kind of evaporated over time and federally not supported. And I think there's a place for some sort of short-term housing option while being flexible, while giving people the privacy and dignity and respect and care that they need, because shelters are what they are, shelters, right? Like, they provide you just shelter for a period of time. And for many different reasons, like, folks would rather be on the street, right? But what we've seen is, during the pandemic, in moving people for safety reasons into temporary housing and hotels, having that privacy and having that space to yourself, we've been hearing anecdotally, has been really effective in assisting many members of the community. So I would be a proponent for more housing. I would be a proponent for more flexible housing options, temporary to permanent, so that folks can work on their health, folks can work on their, psychiatric care and behavioral health care needs and all those other, personal goals that folks have, connecting with family. A lot of bridges are burned through the process of being homeless and not caring for oneself. In addition to that, I would say more flexible treatment options. It is expensive, but as Dr. Yu said, it is worth it. Our IMT programs are set up to allow our teams to have that flexibility to go out and engage and meet with people and take as long as they need to, providing wraparound services, providing meals, providing a cell phone if you need someone, if you need to reach your family and things like that. And so I think there is a place for that. But I will say that the one challenge that many of our treatment providers find is housing, right? Like knowing that you have an application that is approved. Now what do you do, right? And also, like with some of our less intensive mobile treatment services, we have about 27% of our ACT consumers have been with ACT teams for 5 or more years. It's generally a program model that we think an average length of stay is 2.5, 3 years. And what we're hearing is, people enjoy the service, enjoy the flexibility, but also the options for stepping down from mobile treatment. There aren't very many, right? Outpatient clinics may be full and or don't offer the same flexibility that mobile treatment does, and that if someone is set up for an outpatient appointment and they start working with someone, let's say they miss a couple of appointments, there's a good chance your case at the site will eventually be closed, right? And you're going to be lost to care and lost to contact. And so adding some buffering, some flexibility there and additional funding, I would say, because I think part of the issue here is that these clinics can't bill for outreach. They can't bill to go visit someone at home and say, hey, you missed your appointment, is everything okay? And so they're forced to close cases out and people are lost. And so I think some additional funding for clinics to be able to offer support services could be really helpful.
Okay, thank you. And Elliot?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to take a slightly different tact on this. Obviously, I agree there needs to be more housing, and as what everybody has said, supportive and transitional housing, I think, is extremely valuable and it is essential. But I think even going down one area that is even more essential is we really need to build up our trust. We need to build up motivation. We need to build up hope, because you can see Catherine did a great job. I've never seen it laid out so smoothly. All these services that are provided, and it's provided in all 5 boroughs. It's there, but a lot of the people, Nick's groups are going out and talking. People aren't even motivated to go try those things. And Dr. Yu talked about, how much time and how expensive it is just to build that trust. Yet none of us are talking about why is that the case, except for Sadie, I think, to a certain degree, is talking about, but why is that the case, that there's such a deficit of trust and hope in motivation? And I think that's because of that serious mental illness creates isolation, creates stigma. And for anybody, forget whether you have a mental illness, a lot of our trust and motivation and hope comes from our community, from our family, from our friends. We talk to people. Should I take this treatment? Should I move into this apartment? Should I take this room, even though maybe it's not in the neighborhood I want? very seldom do people like us, we'll talk that over with somebody we trust, someone we chose. And we need to create these pocket communities where people are. We need to imbue them with trust. We know how to do this. And then we can leverage that. And I think it is a practical way to take care of these deficits, because as long as you have a trust deficit and a motivation deficit and a hope deficit, you can come up with the best services and the best housing. And in the end, we're going to have a revolving door. All these people came, most of these people, when we talked to them, they had treatment, they had housing at some point. But what they had more of was isolation that allowed them to get into trouble and lose all those things. And now they're either think it's too difficult to bring back. And I think we need to invest heavily in a new model or models, multiple models that are really doing this kind of work to support and help access all these other great supports that Catherine and Dr. Yu have pointed out that are already there. And the statistics, the research shows they work. Supportive housing works, but we need to create this kind of infrastructure underneath that, which is really kind of a trust and motivation. And I think community is probably the fastest, easiest way to do that. And there's plenty of research to show that works. And we can use things like peers and the lived experience, and we can create pocket environments. We can create more sophisticated communities of engagement like clubhouses, but we can create small, simple ones, kiosks and things like that are extremely effective to help support and connect people to all those services. And I think it's a much more humane way to do it, because you're building for the future. Community is a key for predicting success, whether that's predicting treatment adherence, wellness, physical wellness, keeping your housing, being employed. Social networks are really important, and we can do that. We can do that. We can help with that.
Thank you, Elliot. My question was about the same people that we see over and over, or that I should say you all. I work in a different kind of area in social work that you all see over and over in this revolving door. And it sounds like what you're all saying. I took some notes and circled some things that everyone mentioned, and that's housing, treatment capacity. Everyone said housing. It looks like treatment capacity, addressing the mental health diagnosis or the behavioral health and the mental health needs, and trust. And since it looks like we have a little bit more time right before we move on to the questions that folks who signed up sent in, I just want to ask one question, and if we have time, maybe Renee might have a question as well. My question is really around people that I'm having a little bit of trouble thinking about how to frame the question, but I'm wondering, would everyone have the same answer, I guess, if we're talking about people who are the most serious mentally ill? And when I say that, really what I mean, I'm talking about people who are a danger to themselves and others. Would the responses be the same? And I guess we can start with, I'm going to just do it backwards really quick. And if we could keep your answers as brief as possible so we can go on to constituent questions. Elliot?
Yes, I think the answers would be exactly the same.
Okay. Catherine?
Most of it will be the same. I will say that with the institutionalization, rightfully so, like the way in which we provide treatment and involuntarily hospitalize someone has changed. People have right to self-determination, and once they're stable, can be released from a hospital, whether they have housing or not, whether they have been successfully connected to treatment or not, right? Hospitals can do that. Do I agree with that 100%? I don't. It's not ideal, but the hospitals have their own challenges, right? They can't keep folks forever. And so, psychiatric centers are not utilized the way that they were before. So yeah, long and short, I think, if there were other ways to incentivize longer term care until people can be successfully connected to treatment, that would be ideal, and housing.
Thank you. Next would be Sadie.
I think I agree with Catherine to some extent that people can't be held forever, and people can't be held until the capacity becomes available for them to get connected with treatment. Because at the point when they're no longer in acute danger to themselves or others, when they get hospitalized, the goal is stabilization. So to answer your original question, when somebody is presenting that level of dangerousness, it's the role of the clinicians in the hospital setting to resolve those symptoms. And they, by and large, do a great job. So once those symptoms are resolved, there's not at that point a constitutional basis to hold them any longer, because it is such a massive curtailment of their liberty and such an infringement on their right to self-determination. So at that point, I think it is critically important that there are services available to them that they can get connected to quickly. Transitional housing or long-term supportive housing would be the most ideal thing, but the capacity is just not there at the moment that it is needed necessarily.
Okay. And you did say housing. Okay, thank you, Sadie. And then Dr. Yu and then Nick.
Yeah, so I've actually been agonizing over this question my whole career, which is now 25 plus years.
Great, let's hear it. Let's hear
yeah,
it.
so this is and although I change my mind about this every 5 years, but I'll say two things about this. The first thing is a repeat of what everyone else has said, and even I've said, is that I think at the end of the day that the more you can tailor and individualize everyone's, care and services, the more successful you're going to be. And that is a really big investment, but it ends up being cost effective, not to mention humane. Okay, let's say we could do that. In a fantasy world, we could do all that and I think you'd like sweep up most people that way. I do still think you're going to have this small cohort of people that you're describing, Maria, who's really serious mental illness, and their mental illness is actually really impairing their ability to accept care, or to even to accept that they're living with some kind of mental illness, right? That it really impairs the fancy term is decisional capacity, right? And this goes back to something I said earlier, that there is a role for involuntary care, including involuntary hospitalizations, but this law has been on the books for years, a way to do involuntary outpatient care. So the person's out in the community, like being free of the hospital, but their care is actually mandated, right? This is assisted outpatient treatment, right? And that, I'm not an expert on assisted outpatient treatment, but for certain people, that's been very effective. Well, for one thing, keeping them out of the hospital. So I think that, I don't know if I'm advocating for more assisted outpatient treatment. The assisted outpatient treatment has its problems too, and its issues, right? But I would imagine there would be ways to, examine AOT, to maybe tweak it in certain kinds of ways to actually make it more variable in the way it's executed and dispersed to people. And if there were enough services to support it, yeah.
I'm sorry, can you just, for folks who are listening in, like in 15 seconds, mention what AOT is?
Yes, assisted outpatient treatment. I forget someone help me. Sadie, you probably know this right off the top of your head. The original law was referred to as somebody's
Kendra's law.
Kendra's law, yes, right, yeah. So I won't get into that story. If we have time at the end, you can ask me. But
Right.
that
right.
led to this law that you can, that in certain circumstances, you can mandate a person to continue certain kinds of outpatient psychiatric treatment. For example, you can mandate someone to continue taking certain kinds of medications, right? And you know, the big question at the beginning of this is like, well, is it going to help, right? And it, you know, and is it too much of an infringement of people's liberties? That question I'm going to put is like, I think people have all kinds of opinions about that, including me, which maybe I'll hold to myself. But I do think that there's a lot of data showing that, again, for a certain cohort of people, it does really help those people stay safer, be safer to the community, stay out of the hospital, stay housed, like all these things. So that's like so that kind of involuntary mandating of care and services, I think also has a place for the people you're referring to, Maria.
Thank you. And I just have to share, I think it's fitting at this very moment, is that yesterday, actually, a Patch article went out that I was quoted in, and this is kind of getting at the crux of some of like what you're talking about, that struggle, I think, is that feeling as though people who suffer and struggle and sometimes are a safety risk to others and themselves are not treated in the way. There's this sense that when there's an animal who is suffering and struggling, right, in the street, we care for them, right? And we don't do the same thing for other human beings. And so kind of like that struggle. And so I appreciate what you're saying and you sharing that you have this struggle within yourself about which position you take, and it changes, and you do this work, and you've been doing this work over 20 years.
If I could take 30 seconds to tell a story.
Yes, 30 seconds, and then I want to run over to jump over to Nick.
So this guy that I think about all the time regarding this exact issue. I met this guy 12 or 15 years ago when I used to do street outreach myself, and he was living under the FDR Drive, right at the end of Wall Street, ironically, right? It's partly why I love this story, right? And he was living with schizophrenia, and the reason he was always declining services, including care from me, was that he was waiting for the aliens to pick him up, and he was guarding the harbor for the aliens, right? And he was happy as a clam, and he took really good care of himself, and he was clearly not a danger to himself or others. And I always think of him, I'm like, and because he wasn't a danger, he wasn't even close to meeting involuntary care or commitment criteria then or now, right? And so he would just live there, right, for weeks and weeks and months and months. I lost track of him. I don't know where he is now. And I've always thought to myself, like, really? Like, we're okay with this? Like, I don't feel okay with that, but I don't know that I have a really good answer for that guy. So.
Yeah, thank you. Nick?
I'll keep it really brief and pretty specifically
Yes,
to outreach for this. And I know, this has probably gone a little longer than you wanted, but to really address specifically what you're talking about, folks who truly present as an imminent danger to themselves or to someone else from our end on the street in the direct practice work, our role shifts at that point. So we have a group of qualified mental health professionals who go out and do evaluations on those folks. I'm one of them. And if the determination is made that they meet that criteria, then, like I said, we shift into initiating these involuntary transports to a qualified emergency room, a CPEP, as we've talked about earlier, often with the assistance of the police, because, involuntary means exactly that. I've initiated one of those within the last month for someone in Midtown who ended up being evaluated both medically and psychiatrically and was admitted and was inpatient for a while. So that's the quickest I can answer it. If someone is truly a danger to themselves or others, then our perspective changes and our assessment changes and our action changes.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you, everyone. And now I'm going to hand this over to you, Joseph.
All right, thank you, Maria. Again, I'm Joseph Brewer. I'm on Community Board 5. I serve with Renee on the Budget Education City Services Committee. I also happen to work at CUCS, so I know Dr. Yu from there, full disclosure. But, we've gotten a lot of questions, which is amazing. But we did offer participants the opportunity to submit questions in advance. So I do want to cover a couple of those. Some of these topics we've already talked about in depth. So if I'm skipping some, it's because I feel like we've already covered a few. I think one recurring theme that's already come up a lot already, and it's a question we got before the panel, was regarding kind of a curiosity about changing the law about involuntary admission. So not to rehash something that we've already talked about, I think that after this conversation, we understand what the current qualifications are, or how a doctor or a judge in a hospital makes a determination that someone should be involuntarily committed. Sadie has said that, the person has to be deemed a danger to themselves or another person. And Dr. Yu mentioned, kind of another involuntary option for people who might be appropriate is assisted outpatient treatment. Am I getting that name right? So this is the law as it exists, and this is how our system deals with patients in this situation under that law. I guess I would put this out to the panel. Is there, whether or not you would advocate for this, or maybe of an elected official who's advocating for something. We had a question about whether there should be a change to the law around involuntary admission, whether it's inpatient or outpatient. Whether someone on this panel thinks there might be a change we should consider, or whether, you'd like to point out, a debate that's happening among lawmakers about a potential change for how we decide when a person is involuntarily admitted or put into a treatment plan. I think, Sadie, this would naturally fall to you, but I'm open to
I
anyone's.
was going to take it.
Yeah.
Look, I think the bottom line is that there's a constitutional floor. The US Supreme Court has said that people cannot be hospitalized by reason of mental illness unless they pose a danger to themselves or others. So that's the baseline from which we are operating. The reason for that is a concern that somebody might be different than you, or seem strange to you, or be in some way undesirable, and get hospitalized for those kinds of reasons. And so because that had happened historically, and because the court was very invested in ensuring that that not happen in the future, that's the constitutional floor that was set. So while I do think that there is some wiggle room in terms of the language, the specific language of the New York statutes that effectuate that law, I don't think that basic standard is ever going to change. Now, there was a legislative proposal last year that I saw that was basically intending to elucidate the standard as it exists in New York law, to talk a little bit more about how a danger to oneself could be posed by one's failure or inability to care for oneself in the community, and sort of talking more directly about this idea that if you are incapable of meeting your own needs for food and shelter and medical care, that maybe that could be a basis for involuntary hospitalization. Had that law passed, which it didn't, I think it would have been somewhat susceptible to challenge. But as I understand it, the reason behind it was that some legislators felt that this dangerous to self or others standard was being too stringently applied by the people on the street who have are in a position to decide whether somebody should go to a CPAP to an emergency room setting in the first place. So that would be all of the outreach people, as well as the police who are seeing people in the first place. I think that's a really dangerous change to enact legislatively, because it gets awfully close to this idea that somebody could potentially be hospitalized for undesirability. But I guess I am just mentioning that that is out there, or is one of the few attempts that I have seen legislatively to change the statutes as they exist in New York.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful to know. Do any of the other panelists have a comment on this question or on that effort that Sadie just mentioned?
I mean, I think it begs the question of what, involuntary hospitalization or AOT, we should be really asking the question, what are we hoping is the outcome other than just a temporary, talk about a revolving door, that's a lot of the revolving door. A lot of the people are getting involuntarily hospitalized, getting out, getting involuntary. We should be really focusing on how we can make that process effective. How effective is it? Not its effect based on removing the person from the community. Then yes, that's quite effective. It gets them off the street. But how effective is it in actually dealing with the underlying issue? And that isn't as addressed as it probably should be, because it is the most expensive of the treatments often that these people are receiving. So, I would hope there would be much more research and much more oversight in saying, is this really effective? Is this really effective? And the question from before was, and I said, no, would you change? I still think the needs are the same. Whether you're a threat to yourself, you still are going to need housing at the end of the day, right? You're still going to need access to clinical service. None of that changes. And until that's in place, it's going to be a revolving door. And I think we're missing the point, the debate over do we need more or less involuntary commitment. It's not a crime to have a mental health crisis. It's not even a crime to have a mental health crisis that puts your own life at risk. People haven't made a choice to do that. We need to be creating systems and safety nets that can provide effective care, not just isolationist care. And if we honestly say that we think this is the best care for somebody, then I think we should have more of it. But I don't think anybody here would actually say that.
I was going to say a similar thing, Elliot, about, make those few hospitalizations that do happen, make them more effective, right? And can you make the inpatient units so effective that some people, even if they kind of don't want to be admitted, once they're in, they're like, okay, fine, it's not that bad. I kind of like it here anyway, like that sort of thing. Like, and I think back when there was more capacity, I mean, this was sort of variable based on unit, a doctor, a nurse, and all this kind of stuff. But I think one of the issues is that there actually, I still believe there's not enough capacity at the moment in, either acute inpatient or state. When I was back at Bellevue as a resident in the 90s, there was a lot more capacity. And I felt like we were able to, well, for one thing, just spend more time with our patients while they're in the hospital, even if they don't want to be there. And I felt like we had a more opportunity and more time, right? If you're in the hospital with like, for instance, let's say you have an exacerbation of schizophrenia, right? And you're in the hospital and you haven't taken medicine for a long time. And let's assume for a moment that medicine's going to help you, which it does for many people. Well, 3 or 4 days, which is probably what the length of stay is these days, that's just not going to be enough, right? So like you went ahead and took away this person's liberties for a few days and then didn't really even help, right? So I guess I'm going to advocate something that Sadie's going to, I think, grimace about. Like, if you're going to admit someone, like admit him for a couple of weeks or 4 weeks, or like, let's give it some time, and like, including give time to the nurses and the therapists and the doctors to like spend time with their patients. There's just not enough capacity for that anymore for a variety of reasons. So.
I think I would answer that though by saying that I see the lack of capacity in the lack of staffing, which I think goes directly to what you're talking about. Bellevue Hospital is licensed for 330 inpatient beds, and currently there is in the neighborhood of 220 patients occupying those beds. And the reason for that is that there's not enough staff. And when there's not enough staff, those kinds of relationships that you're talking about aren't happening for the patients who are there, because everybody's just sort of struggling to keep their heads above water and do the bare minimum. And not, I don't mean to denigrate the clinicians there at all. I think that they all do their very best to go above and beyond every day, but it is really hard when there's not enough support.
There is a healthcare worker shortage nationwide in general, but particularly mental health. It's like worse with mental health care, even in a place like New York City, where you spit and hit a psychiatrist. Because even though there's a lot of psychiatrists in the city, like this sector is under-resourced. I can't hire psychiatrists fast enough. So
I'll jump in too and say, from the outreach side of things, the involuntary transport, that's the nuclear option. Like that's our final line, right? There's nothing after that for us. So I'm going to agree with some of the things that are said here. If you're going to do it, you want to do it right. You want the actual period of stabilization. You want the relationships with the clinicians that are providing the treatment, and you want a solid aftercare plan for when they're coming out. There's nothing more devastating for the outreach staff and the clinicians that work on my teams than to go through one of these things, which is upsetting for everyone involved, and then have the person come back out a few days later, still potentially highly symptomatic, and now you've just completely destroyed your entire rapport with them. So it's not even like you're starting from zero, you're starting from like below zero.
Thanks. I think this is so interesting. Maybe we can dig into this a little bit more, because we've heard a lot about gaps, right? What don't we have enough of? I think almost everyone agrees that supportive housing is one of those. I've heard ACT mentioned, IMT. These are services for after someone is in the hospital, if they are in the hospital. We haven't heard about healthcare staff shortages and kind of lack of capacity in city hospitals quite as much. So I guess I'd be interested to hear, is it just a simple matter of funding? Is it if New York City Health and Hospitals put more funding into, hiring psychiatrists, expanding inpatient units, would that help solve this problem? Or is there some other angle to this that we should talk about?
Well, I could start on that one. So funding is part of it, right? That I have friends making a lot of money being a psychiatrist, right? And I choose to work for a nonprofit. I'm leaving a lot of money on the table. Like, I'm not complaining, I'm doing okay, but that's an issue, right? When people have six-figure educational loans and kids to feed and mortgages and all this kind of stuff. And by the way, people from the communities from which we're talking about, right, or some of the communities we're talking about, are the people who are most likely to have those six-figure educational loans, right? And there's not really good ways to address that, right? So you end up, so the nonprofit sector is really, disadvantaged compared to some other places, especially the nonprofit sector serving people who are homeless. And then this is the last thing I'll say about this, that, if you want to work at a place like Bellevue, if you want to really serve, one of the reasons I chose Bellevue is because I wanted to serve people, right? And I'm in the nonprofit sector because I want to serve people. But Bellevue could be a really hard place to work. I don't want to pick on Bellevue. I love Bellevue actually, but like if you're understaffed, I'll just use the understaffing example that Sadie gave. Well, instead of, treating 15 patients or something like that, you've got 30, right? You don't have time for that. Like, you can't spend any time with people if you got to see 30 people today, right? And there's not enough nurses, and there's not enough aides, and there's not enough. So, how long are people going to do that before they burn out, right? And again, like when their buddy who they trained with has got like an office on Park Avenue and it's like raking it in, right? So it's not just money, although that's definitely part of it, but it's also, work environment. and the ability to practice medicine in a way that makes sense, right? That's really hard to do in a lot of these settings.
So it's funding and it's kind of leadership and management of these major institutions, right? And that's a much more complicated question, I would think.
Yeah, like for instance, I'll just give you one more example, right? If you work at a place where most of the funding is coming from billing of Medicaid, right? Like this, we're serving a community of people who Medicaid is their insurance if they have insurance, right? Well, Medicaid, in reimbursement is such that if just to keep the lights on, I got to see 30 people in a day, right? Like again, how long am I going to do that for before I'm like, I'm out of here, I'm burnt out of this, right? Again, even if people who care about this, right? I'm starting to have trouble keeping people who came to this work because they really cared about it. And it's too much. It's just because it's not just their salary, it's the resources around them too.
Thanks. Anyone else have any comment about that?
I agree with Dr. Yu. I think we're all doing more with less these days. We're seeing staff shortages across the board. And, for many different reasons, as already mentioned, I think there's room to incentivize staff that go into this field. I think there's room for more loan forgiveness as an incentive for recent graduates to want to do the work and commit for a period of time. Burnout is real, and the pandemic certainly didn't help, right? I think there's more demand for mental health services, and there's more freedom to go and do your own thing. I'm a clinical social worker, and many clinicians have left to work their own practice because they can, and they can do it virtually, and they can do it from home, and they don't necessarily need to go through a lot of the typical paperwork processes that you go through working at nonprofits or when you're billing for Medicaid or other insurance. And so I think there's room for us to rebuild, reinvent the workforce in the city, in this industry in particular, and community behavioral health, I think in particular, incentivize them, make more differential pay for community work. We recognize that there's a demand, and it also takes more of a toll on folks. And while working for the city, we have, and partnering with the state, we have ongoing communication with hospitals, and are recognizing that some of the numbers point to reduced utilization in the hospitals. And why is that? Right? Units are closing, units are being repurposed for COVID reasons, right? Whether that's temporary or temp to perm. And so I think, we're all trying to keep an eye to make sure that we don't lose that resource, because it's not going to, I don't see it flipping back and going from like med surge to psych inpatient units, or once it goes to med surge, it's gone. And so these are the things that I think we all have to keep an eye on.
Sorry, had to unmute. Thank you. So I want to move on to another question we got before this panel started. And I think a few questions we got during in the Q&A kind of relate to this. And it's getting into, an issue that's pretty fraught, and it's the role of the NYPD in responding to individuals, who are living on the street or maybe in shelter and are just on the street at that moment, who are experiencing an active mental health crisis. So, and I think where this question comes from, just from speaking with other people on the board, is, I think people in the community want to know what to do. One, do you call 311? Do you call 911? I know this panel has talked about that a little bit. But, I think there's also a lot of confusion around what the police department should be doing. And how they should be intervening in these situations, and actually what's happening right now. Like, is there currently a policy that NYPD intervenes at a certain level of a situation that's called in to either 311 or 911? So maybe thinking of maybe Nick, if you wouldn't mind starting us off just with like telling us what is the current partnership or situation, with NYPD? How do outreach teams partner with NYPD, and what are you seeing there?
Sure. I mean, 911 calls in general go to emergency services, right? Police, fire, EMS, whatever, often some combination of those things. For us, our work with the police is, I think, more often collaborative than anything else. So we have relationships with the local precincts, with the neighborhood coordination officers, the NCOs, who I'm sure a lot of folks on this call from the community have had interactions with or been to these build the block meetings and so forth. So we work with those folks. The recently created business improvement unit, which in some ways is kind of a revival of the previously disbanded homeless outreach unit, was a specific unit of the NYPD that we have interaction with more so recently. So we will at times set up a joint outreach with them. Guys who walk the beat in the streets every day know the folks that they come across every day. So sometimes those relationships can be helpful for us to leverage. And in a situation with, say, an involuntary transport, like what I described a moment ago, the police needed to be there because I can't physically grab someone and put them in the back of an ambulance. And yet sometimes that is what it comes to. I think the real distinction that I would like to draw is that we're social services providers, right? Outreach, social work, et cetera. We're not law enforcement. We're not there to uphold the law. We're not there to see, we're not really interested in criminal activity, anything like that. That's just a completely different role. So if someone is truly threatening or menacing or dangerous, that to me is a 911 call. If someone looks like they're hurt or about to become hurt in some way, that's also a 911 call. If it's something a bit more borderline, they just seem to be mentally ill and look like they could use some assistance, that's a 311 call. And for us, when we get there, if we determine that the police need to be involved, EMS needs to be involved, we call them and we wait there and we tell them what we've seen, our assessment, and we'll engage with them. So yeah, it's usually an active collaboration from our end.
Thanks.
Joseph, I just want to give you a quick time check.
Yeah. Thank you. I know I should move more into the live Q&As. Yeah. But just so you know, a lot of these came up in the live Q&As as well. So I'm blending. So thanks, Nick. Does anyone else have any comment? I guess kind of the question that comes up from that is, does anyone on this panel think there should be changes in how the police department interacts with the current system of homeless services providers or with individuals that are living on the street?
There's a pilot program happening in East Harlem that you guys should be interested in, right? It's referred to as Be Heard. It's Behavioral Health Emergency Assistance Response Division. I can't believe I remembered the whole thing. So there's 4 precincts in East Harlem now that when you call 911 and the dispatcher determines that it's a mental health issue, that a team, it's NYPD and Health and Hospital social worker team goes to encounter the person, right? And I don't have the data off the top of my head, but those teams don't bring the person to the hospital as much. People get hooked up with service. It's working really well, is my point, right? In November, they're to expand to West Harlem, and there is some idea about expanding into the Bronx, hopefully later this year. Anyway, it's on somebody's website. I forget whose, right? So BHEARD, and it sounds like it's going really well. So check it out.
Great, thanks. All right, so I'm going to transition more explicitly into the Q&As because we got a lot during this conversation. So I'm sorry that I won't be able to hit everything. We're trying to keep it to 2 hours, respect everyone's time. So I think looking for themes and looking for items that haven't been covered. There were a few questions just generally seeking more information, including statistics. So maybe for some of these, we might just need to follow up afterward and send out more information. But I guess one question that I think is interesting is, what percentage of people who are living on the street who are approached by a street outreach team after a 311 call accept help? Someone was curious about that. So maybe Nick, if you could speak to that.
That's a question for DHS. The number is low, I can tell you. If you want to talk about percentage of total 311 calls for homeless services to the number of people that accept services in that moment, that is a low percentage. That's as specific as I can get, but DHS tracks that stuff. So you could get a pure statistic out of that.
Thanks. And then we talked a lot about gaining trust of folks on the street, you know, on the part of the street outreach teams, street medicine, street psychiatry. One question was, if there is an average ballpark of, you know, for someone who a street outreach or a street medicine team successfully gets to accept services, to move into housing or shelter, how long does that take for the average person?
That's you, Nick.
Yeah. I mean, I can't put a hard number on that. I'm not trying to be evasive. It's just that the individual cases are so radically different. We have folks that we've encountered more than once a day for years. So we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of engagements. And then there are a lot of folks who we literally talk to the first time or the first handful of times who we're able to bring in. And that's happened more and more so, again, over this past year, because what we're offering is more appealing to folks. I don't have just like a pure average across. And I think there are a lot of variables that play into that. Mental health issues, substance use, the kind of trimorbidity, I'll call it, that we see with folks who are truly kind of long-term chronic medical, substance use, and mental health issues. That smaller subsection compared to the totality of New York City homelessness, those folks often require way more engagements than someone who's only dealing with one of those things or is driven to homelessness by different factors. So I don't even know if that would be helpful as an overall statistic, but it's not one that I just have off the top of my head.
Thanks. No, that is helpful. Another question we had was, you know, is there a significant portion of individuals who are living on the street who have been in supportive housing, right? That seems to be the end goal in a lot of ways for someone suffering with serious mental illness who has been homeless. So I guess this kind of gets to retention in supportive housing. You know, are the people that live in our neighborhood who are still living on the street, have a lot of them been in supportive housing and for whatever reason it didn't work out?
That's a statistic I actually can throw at you. So the 1-year retention rate for permanent supportive housing, that's pretty specific in terms of like the type of housing. The 1-year retention rate is at about 98%, actually. It's incredibly effective when they actually get there. It's the getting them there that's the more challenging part.
And so this kind of takes one of our participants asked about a specific proposal trying to increase the amount of supportive housing in the city. So this is more of a policy question, so I'm not sure if anyone here knows, but I think Manhattan Borough President Brewer had a proposal to use closed hotels or just any hotels in the city as supportive housing. You know, I think this question could go to, you know, Elliot, Nick, Dr. Yu, but anyone on the panel. I mean, what are your thoughts about the potential use of hotels that might no longer be needed in the city as supportive housing?
I mean, we think, unfortunately, you know, it has kind of a bad reputation because of the COVID pandemic and having to do it quickly. There weren't enough services wrapped around. So some areas felt that, you know, this is not helping people. It's gotten them off the street, but there are no services, they're hanging out. But we know, as Nick has pointed out, that's not how it has to be. Hotels are actually, you heard what Nick and Dr. Yu and I also agree, kind of when you're looking for what works for supportive housing, this private kind of, but also a communal space to do the stuff I was talking about, building community and stuff like that. Hotels are actually pretty perfect buildings to do that kind of work. And obviously, there are a number of street homeless in Midtown. There are a number of hotels in Midtown. It's kind of a match. So, but you have to have the programming. You have to have the support in that. Just like we have residences here in Midtown. And most people don't even know we have townhouse resident. You know, they're like, oh, you have resident. They know the big building where we have like 350 people coming in every day, and we don't have problem. They're like, oh, you have residences too? It's like, yeah, we've had them for 40, 50 years. You know, it doesn't have to be, I think it can be done well. I think it is done well in this city all over the place. You know, so I think it's a good idea as long as there's programming dollars also with it.
There was a time when hotels provided I don't know what percentage, but a significant portion of the housing in the city, the Bowery, right? There were problems with the Bowery, but it did provide housing for a bunch of people who otherwise probably would have been living outside. Here's a funny problem with hotel rooms: no kitchens, right? And that ends up being an obstacle to conversion, right? That it can be really difficult and expensive to convert hotel rooms into apartments because of the kitchen situation. However, going back to the Bowery, not that I want to go all the way back to flop houses, but I don't know that everybody who could benefit and who would want permanent supportive housing would want or need a kitchen, right? So I actually would be in favor of some amount of hotel conversion without necessarily converting them all the way to studio apartments with kitchens.
So essentially going back to what we used to call SROs, you know, single room occupancy type.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
I used the less good term flop houses, but you know, I think you can run a really good, humane, service-rich flop house. Like I really can actually, and I think for some people that would be great.
And it's interesting, you know, SRO, flop house, hotel, these all have bad connotations, and they should. They weren't great. They were considered a low level of housing for the most marginalized. But co-housing, you know, is something that lots of people are doing. It's some of the more expensive real estate actually in our Midtown area. These experiments with Europe has been doing it. You know, you don't need separate kitchens. You can do a co-housing. You can do a respectful and powerfully recovery orientated thing that isn't a flop house, isn't just isolation. We have to reimagine this, and we don't have to do it because it's already being done. It's just being done for wealthy people, really. But the model is still the same.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're all saying that if the services are where they need to be, we have enough services funding, then, you know, what supportive housing looks like, you know, can really vary, you know, and there's lots of different ways that we could provide it for different types of people. So I guess going back to shelters, you know, this is kind of a random question, but I think one that people would find interesting. We see a lot of large shelters, you know, in New York City, you know, up to 200 beds. Be interested in the folks who are involved in social services at any level on this panel. If you have any thoughts on the ideal size of a shelter, you know, how many people it would house in order to have the best outcomes for clients. I wasn't going to ask anyone in particular, but, you know, I guess, Nick, you're a natural person to go to.
So the one that I oversee that's, you know, it's not permanent housing, it's 84 beds. It's in actually a formerly converted hotel. It's been working. It's a good number, but Breaking Ground operates a safe haven out in Midwood in Brooklyn. That's substantially smaller. It's like 35 people, 36 people. And then there are some safe havens that range up to 200, like you said. The difference, I think, is the support services that are on site and the number of staff that you have and the opportunities that people have within the facility. Not just to work towards permanent housing, but to work towards all these other things. I think that community model and this fountain house model that has come up many times, that matters. Like, and I think that I think it's less the number in a facility than it is the gradual integration so that it becomes just an aspect in a seamless way of the community. The big problem, I think, with what's happened in this COVID migration of people over the last year is you suddenly dumped 8,000 people into a neighborhood and essentially just said, here's a room, see you later. So I have an apartment. I leave it all the time, right? You can't just expect people to be warehoused in rooms and not go out into the community. When you suddenly have 8,000 people in a place where they never were before, you're going to notice. If everybody goes outside to smoke a cigarette at the same time, that's going to be pretty eye-popping. What if they have their friends come over too and their families? Then it's just pandemonium, right? And that's essentially, I don't mean to make light of it, and I'm sorry to be so kind of cartoonish in my gestures, but the idea that you're just going to put someone inside and that's going to be the end all be all, that's a massive first step, but there's got to be more to it. So whether you've got a facility that has 30 people in it or 100 people or 180 people, those services have to be there and folks have to be engaged with something other than just having a place to live.
It's really hard to nurture a community in any group of people more than 100, right? So we believe, right, that operating shelters of less than 100 people gives you an opportunity to, you have to right size the services, right? But gives you an opportunity to create a community of the group of people in the shelter that helps the shelter run better, that helps people support each other, including in the housing process.
Thanks. And I guess this kind of brings me to a question that ties perfectly into that. I mean, I think for the average participant here, I think most of us want to do something to help. We see a very complicated situation. Most people that are participating, want to help solve the problem. So I guess, what would the people here tell the average resident of Hell's Kitchen, Chelsea, who have kind of gone through these weird last couple of years where we have had an influx, especially into the hotels in the neighborhood? Any recommendations for what you think people on this, that are watching this might be able to do to maybe help better integrate or create a better sense of community to help the programs that are here in the neighborhood succeed? Any thoughts on that?
I do. I know in at least Hell's Kitchen, a lot of people know the people and don't assume. I mean, it's very tough for you to know if somebody's homeless or not. I think Nick was kind of alluding to that. Some people are in the shelter or even have a home, but they have nothing to do all day. So they're not just going to sit in their room. They're going to be out sitting in the park, and maybe the symptoms are less so when they're out. But letting them know about things, and that's why we like things like the pocket environments that are alibi places, like the recharge station on Times Square, where it can be used by anybody. Be like, hey, I see you every day. The person's like, hey, can I get some money? Or you have a cigarette, and say, hey, if you ever need extra help, you go to the recharge station and they'll help you. They help all sorts of people. Trust is this thing that I talked about earlier, building trust, building links of trust. Breaking Ground is very good at that. I see them use other trust agents to kind of vouch for them all the time. The neighborhood often has relationships with individuals, and they are a trust agent. You may not think so, but you saying, hey, why don't you go check out this thing? Maybe even walking them over there. That can be powerful. That could be something people could do, or walk them to Fountain House. Fountain House, you can walk it, you can do a walk-in referral and fill out an application as an individual. Just connect them if you can. Midtown has got a lot of great services. Breaking Ground is there. We're there. It's not a shortage of groups that have been there well before COVID and will be there well after COVID. Very embedded, deep roots in our neighborhood.
Thanks. Dr. Yu?
I'll say this. Yeah, I think a right-sized, well-resourced, well-run shelter or safe haven or even drop-in center or supportive housing site will make your neighborhood better, right? Because as Nick alluded to earlier, the people who you see outside, that's their neighborhood, right? They're not going anywhere, right? For the most part. So if a neighborhood, if a community can provide housing for that person in the neighborhood, that's better, right? And a good housing program, for example, we've seen this in many places, like a good housing program can, rehabilitate an old building that wasn't being used for anything or was being used for stuff you didn't want it to be used for. Some of these buildings even, you end up having some storefront space that's rehabilitated. And not to mention all the staff that's coming to work every day that's spending no money in your neighborhood. So I encourage people to be more open-minded and actually maybe even embracing of these kinds of programs in their own neighborhood. It really does improve it. We've watched it improve neighborhoods. There are some neighborhoods in the city that, having had an experience working with some of these programs, like invite these agencies like, hey, we got another building around the corner. Could you start another one? So I think it's really worth people's whiles to look into this.
Thanks. I guess this might be a question that, maybe one of the community boards already has this available, but I feel like, Catherine, maybe I should ask you this. Are you aware of a map or a chart that, the community board or participants here might be sent that just kind of shows exactly where all these services, permanent housing, social services, outreach are located, in our neighborhood and throughout Manhattan that we could easily access?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I would start with the State Office of Mental Health. They have a directory where you can look up by zip code what's available in your neighborhood. There isn't necessarily a map, because I think we have to remember too that to some degree some of this is there are HIPAA laws and supportive housing isn't always identified for the public, because it implies there's someone living there with some sort of disability. So I think that needs to be factored in, but certainly I would start with the local state government directories for programs to know the resources in your area. I don't know if others have any other thoughts on that.
Thanks. All right, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. I'm sorry that I didn't get to get to all of the great questions. Hopefully we covered at least a good handful, but Renee, I think I'll hand it back to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for getting to the questions that you did. I want to thank the panelists for all their insightful and thoughtful responses to our questions. But just one last go around for the audience and for the electeds who would like to provide support or be proactive in this area. What's your recommendation or specific call to action for people who really want to do something to move this, not problem, but this situation forward? And I'll go backwards, I guess. I'll start with Elliot.
Well, I think there's broad consensus, which, might have shocked people at first, looking at the diversity, from Sadie to Catherine to myself to Nick to Dr. Yu. But I think there's broad consensus that it is a few things, but you need them to be there together. It's not just one thing, and that's often the problem. It's not an infinite number of things either. It's a few discrete things. And I think I would lay them out. Is you need housing. You need more, and specifically, if you have to put dollar down, supportive housing is going to save you money, and it's going to be the most effective at this point because of the backlog, because of the lack of it. I think you need to have community-based services like Breaking Ground and these groups to be able to connect people to the housing we just talked about, into other services, and build this trust. Also, just as important for the citizens of the community to see that somebody is helping, that somebody's actually doing something. That's so important. And as a politician and a political representative, I would think I would want people to see that there's actually. And then I think the third thing is the clinical services. That there's, as Dr. you said, you have to give people enough time, whether that's in the hospital or whether that's in the supportive housing. And I think Catherine has kind of shown a variety of things that are kind of doing that. And I think if we do all of that, I think, we will have less involuntary hospitalization. We'll have less of a, what are we going to do kind of approach in moving people forward. So I think there's broad consensus here.
Thank you. Sadie, what is your call to action for people in the audience or our electeds? Anyone listening?
I agree with everything that Elliot just said. I mean, I think that from my perspective as somebody who advocates for less involuntary hospitalization when that's what my clients want, I certainly want to see resources in the community that they can access in lieu of inpatient hospitalization once they are stable enough to be out of the hospital setting. And then going back to what we had talked about a little bit earlier about having adequate resources in the hospital to make people feel like the treatment that they receive there is really meaningful and to make them more invested in sticking with it. This idea that you get stabilized on medication and then you go back out into the community doesn't really get to the root of the mental health problems that people are facing. So I would like to see more respect for people where they are at and not Band-Aid type treatment, which can sometimes be what the revolving door situation looks like.
Thank you. Catherine, your call to action, people.
I echo Elliot and Sadie. I would say, we have to address social determinants of health. Housing is healthcare. It's cost effective. Treatment needs to remain flexible. We need more community behavioral health services that are flexible and not dependent on billing Medicaid. We need relationships with the local correctional health services. With bail reform, we're seeing people who are quickly released, and that's great, but need connections, and they need connections fast. And so building up those resources in the courts, I think, could be very beneficial for many individuals.
Thank you. Dr. Yu.
I'm actually throw out something very specific, and I'm reminded of the saying, all politics is local, that there's probably a number of programs that are wanting to provide temporary or permanent housing or other services to people who are homeless in your community that are having trouble getting off the ground. And typically, Joseph could speak a lot about this because I'm thinking about the things Joseph faces. And typically, a lot of the obstacles are like very, very local, idiosyncratic things. Like there's like a problem with a building inspection report or something like that, like stuff like that, or there's a community board that's like really has questions about something about the project, right? And those kinds of obstacles can really delay the opening of projects that could be really helpful both to the people we're trying to serve, but also to your community for weeks and months and sometimes even years. So as a community board, if you could figure out where those projects are and decide if they're worth helping and go help them get moving, that would be good for everybody.
Thank you. Nick, last but not least.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with that. Participating with these kind of local groups that can move these projects along, leaning on the elected officials wherever you happen to live to advocate for all the things that we've talked about, to lobby for increased supportive housing, increased affordable housing, and community resources. So out there in the community for mental health resources, for substance use resources. I'm going to throw something out there that didn't come up, but this could be a whole nother conversation. I'm all for safe consumption sites for substance use. I'm all for more modern treatment for substance use, destigmatizing, decriminalization of these kind of, possession use drug crimes, safe injection sites that are staffed with medical personnel and social services personnel. I think I understand a lot of people's concerns. I want to feel safe in the neighborhood that I live in when I walk outside. I have definitely had intense encounters with folks who are clearly having a mental health crisis within a block or two of my own home, right? I do this professionally, but I think I understand what folks are driving at. The thing is, ultimately, you can't just get rid of people, and you're not going to arrest your way out of this problem. So we need to bring the resources to the problem or the issues, I don't even like to say the word problem, that already exist, and address them head on. Like, you've got to look this thing in the eye and provide the solution that the issue needs, not try to crush the issue into solutions that already exist that haven't been effective. So advocating for those things is the call to action that I would recommend.
Thank you so much. Maria?
Right. Thank you, Nick. That was
Really
a
good.
good segue. I appreciate you sharing that you also live in the community. You understand the residents' concerns, and your position also, because you do the work professionally. So you can understand, I think, really well from both perspectives. What I do want to share before I close is two things. CB4, one of the questions that came up was about a map of the social service sites that exist or supportive housing in the community. CB4 actually did a map. It's actually on our website. We did it several months ago, and CB5 is currently working on a similar map. And in Hell's Kitchen, for people who aren't aware, we actually do have a lot of supportive housing, which I think works well for the people that live there and is integrated well into the community. Something that I would say I feel proud about, that there's a lot of supportive housing in the community. And I understand that in New York City, there's not enough. And one of the issues that we deal with, though, in Hell's Kitchen has been an oversaturation of social services. And that's actually one of the reasons we created the map. And I think for everything that we heard tonight was good. I appreciate you all being here. It's a lot to think about, food for thought and food for another panel. Maybe in a couple of months is something Renee and I were talking about. So I'll just wrap up, and I want to say thank you to all the audience members that are here, the attendees. I want to thank each and every panelist. I appreciate you all being here tonight for 2 hours. I want to thank the district managers, Marissa from CB5, Jesse Bodine from CB4, and Joseph. Thank you so much. It's been really a team of like 5 people doing this. We've been working on this for months. And so I can't believe we did it and we're done. And I look forward to us having more discussions around this. Renee, if there's anything you want to say to wrap up.
I just want to echo, I'm so grateful to all the panelists and everyone who worked on this and people who attended. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks
Good night,
very much.
everybody.
Right.
Good night.